Imagine, if you would, a tall, perhaps snow-capped mountain rising out of the mist and into the clouds. Now imagine yourself standing on the very peak of that mountain. See far and wide, the view is breathtaking. A higher mountain means a better view, but a higher mountain also means more climbing, more work to get to the top. In writing, this view from the top of the mountain is the depth of your story. The enjoyment, the intrigue that the reader gets when the plot comes together or they see how a character changes through the story. Depth is responsible for worlds that the reader wants to crawl into, for characters they would love to meet in real life, for stories that feel realistic and relatable and are emotionally evocative. You want a story that has a lot of depth. The height of the mountain, or more specifically, the climb to the top of the mountain, is the complexity of your story. Complexity is the work the reader needs to do in order to experience the depth of your story. The mountain they need to climb in order to take in the view from the peak. And yes, I am aware that the metaphor is backwards because depth should mean you're going down and the mountain means you're going up. You want your story to deliver the maximum amount of depth with the minimum amount of complexity. But there is a relationship between the two. To achieve high levels of depth, you often need to raise the complexity. However, a complex story alone doesn't necessarily have depth. Complexity, as I said, is the work required by the reader in order to experience your story. If the reader needs to keep track of the names and backstories of a dozen characters, that's complexity. If you're writing a legal drama and there's all kinds of laws and jargon and stuff that the reader needs to understand, that's also complexity. Complexity comes in at the plot level, at the scene level, and even at the prose level. For instance, if you have a fight scene that has 5 characters participating, then the reader needs to keep track of all of those characters, where they are, what they're doing, who they're fighting with. If you have a conversation happening between 2 or more characters, the reader needs to keep track of who's saying what and what actions and who's performing those actions in between the dialogue. At the prose level, you can have complex sentences that are difficult to parse, sentences that use big words that make the reader have to get a dictionary out. Plot of your story itself has its own complexity. You can have multiple subplots, a lot of characters, a sprawling and diverse setting. All of this means more effort on the part of the reader. If the story delivers and provides a good payoff in the form of depth for the complexity that needs to be navigated, then the reader will probably stick with it and enjoy the story. If, however, the story just delivers a lot of complexity and a lot of things the reader needs to digest, they're not likely to be interested. But eliminating complexity entirely is not necessarily the goal. People climb mountains for the view, but also for the challenge. This is another sneaky aspect of complexity. Overcoming a certain amount of complexity can be satisfying and fulfilling, and the reader can get a lot of enjoyment out of it. The archetypical example of this is mysteries. People who read mysteries love to piece together all of the clues that make up a complex mystery. And figuring out a mystery is incredibly satisfying. It's one of the reasons people read these sorts of books. Doing some work to experience great depth is very rewarding. However, if the level of complexity is overwhelming or if the depth provided by it is not enough, then you've got a problem. I am going to do a video on depth at some point. It's a much more nebulous topic and I honestly don't know how I would even approach it. So today what we're mainly focusing on are some ways to manage complexity in your writing. Starting out at the plot level, one of the things that you can do is make sure your story is trimmed of any unnecessary detail, or at least any detail that adds complexity without any benefiting depth. If you're into speculative fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, and your story has a pantheon of 38 gods that the reader needs to memorize, that's a lot of complexity, and it's unlikely that a story involving that many is going to be digestible or even enjoyable. Adding a lot of unnecessary characters or locations or other information about your world into your story while it increases the breadth of your story, doesn't necessarily increase the depth. It's often better to go deeper on a few characters or plot threads or elements of the setting rather than trying to do everything in one story. At the scene level, you want to make sure that your POV is clear, that you do a good job of keeping the reader apprised of how events are occurring without overloading them with too much information. If you have a scene taking place in a crowded restaurant, we only need to hear about the actions and the locations and the dialogue from the characters that we're interested in. We don't need to know what's going on at every single other table unless it's relevant. Try to lay out your scenes by grounding the reader in the setting so they know where they are and what's sort of initially going on. Then you can move through events detailing relevant information as it becomes relevant. One place you'll see a lot of excess complexity is in character descriptions. If every time a new character walks on, we learn about every single article of clothing they're wearing, their hairstyle, their facial hairstyle, what kind of glasses, what color eyes they have, what their nose is shaped like, how many fingers they're missing, what jewelry they're wearing, that's often a lot of information that we don't necessarily need. For things like descriptions, you want to focus on things that are relevant to the action happening in the scene, things that help to characterize the character, tell the reader what that character is like, that sort of thing, not just overload the reader with a bunch of excess information that, while it paints a nice picture, adds a lot of complexity that you don't necessarily. And finally, at the prose level, lean towards simpler sentence structures whenever possible. You can keep variety, but avoid anything that's difficult to parse. Keep the thesaurus on the shelf and stick to plain language most of the time. $3 words don't generally improve your writing, and they make your story much more complex to understand. Keep the writing active, as a lot of passive voice can be laborious to read, and passive voice sometimes is more difficult to parse. And it's usually a good idea to adhere to common conventions around things like dialogue formatting, as that's likely what the reader is going to expect. There's a lot more advice I could give here, but really a lot of writing advice comes down to managing complexity. Remember that complexity is a necessary evil in many ways. Your story won't flourish until you've added a certain level of complexity, and it's your job to deliver that to the reader in the best way you can. And as I said at the beginning, managing complexity does not mean reducing your story to something simplistic. If you properly manage complexity, your story will end up being more deep and meaningful to the reader. Just like I hope this video was deep and meaningful to you. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.